So I want to point something out that's interesting. There's a person, Biodegradable Bill, who posts this response to people about the Sabbath whenever I bring it up. And I like what he says because it's ask 10 different people about the Sabbath and the New Covenant, and they'll give you 10 plus different answers. And as you shoot them down one by one, they jump to some other answer that's completely incompatible with the answer they gave before, which tells me something. It tells me they're justifying it after the fact. They haven't actually thought it through. So if you want to impress me, to take you seriously, try not to do that. The Ten Commandments are referenced specifically by like every single writer of the New Testament. He who said, do not steal, do not commit adultery. And then he says, those who break those such things, those commandments, which would be breaking those commandments, will not inherit the kingdom of God. And so here's a demonstration of what I'm talking about regarding the different answers people give. Notice the answer. I might add a few more into that I have, but this is on a video where they're put together. But notice John Piper and John MacArthur give completely opposite answers. What does that say? They both come from the same tradition. So how is this possible?
How people put this commandment into practice. I think it is a matter of what does it mean practically to keep the Sabbath day holy? It seems like it's often a matter of personal conscience, how people put this commandment into practice. I think it is a matter of personal conscience, and by and large probably should be a matter of personal conscience, but that doesn't mean that it has no meaning and no biblical guidelines. The big question for the Sabbath is whether or not in the New Testament God sees there being a commandment to keep the Sabbath day holy in the same way it was commanded in the Old Testament. The Christian Sabbath, the Christian seventh, is Sunday, is the Lord's Day, the resurrection day of Jesus. And I agree with that. I think those who do seventh day things are misunderstanding.
Number 3.
Now remember that, what he said. John Piper, the Reformed, the 5-point Calvinist, says the seventh day people are kind of have missed the boat. They're misunderstanding its purpose. Yes, we need a rest. We need to have a rest day, but it's a matter of personal conscience. Now notice what Rick Warren says. The more progressive non-Calvinist.
This is an important one. Limit my work to 6 days a week. You say, you're kidding me. I'm saying, if you're not doing that, you're breaking one of God's big 10, the 10 commandments. When is your Sabbath? I'm telling you, it doesn't matter what day of the week you take your Sabbath. The Bible says this many times in the New Testament. What day you worship on, what day you take as your day off, as your day of rest, your day of recreation, doesn't matter the day, you just need to do it every week. Okay? My Sabbath is not Saturday. My Sabbath is not Sunday. I'm working on those days. My Sabbath is every Monday.
And he's right. You do need a day off. There's like a word in Japan for people who don't do this. It will kill you early if you don't take time off. So I don't care how holy you are and you're resting in Jesus. You need a day off, and you are morally obligated to offer your employees and those in your household, even your beast of burden, a day off. That is certainly the case. And so who do you think was there in the garden made that Sabbath day holy? Who rested? Was it the Father or was it the Son? Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath, was made man, not man for it. He's obviously he's looking back to Genesis. And then he says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus made the Sabbath. He's the creator. Did you know that?
It's Monday.
New Testament Lord's Day Sunday in any way a replacement for the Jewish Sabbath? And to what degree then should Sabbath principles and also specific laws apply to how I spend Sundays?
Right. Very good question. First answer, no. The Lord's Day is not a replacement of the Sabbath. No. Secondly, there are no Old Testament Sabbath laws that apply to Sunday.
You know who the Sabbaths are for?
Think about what he just said. So he's saying the Sabbath is done away with. John MacArthur does not take the classical reform position, obviously, then, does he? But I bet you if you look at some of his writings, that they'll fly in the face of what he just said, principally speaking. Remember what John Piper said? How can it be? The Reformed tradition has a very solid history of having this worked out, or do they? And if it's such an obvious thing, or if it's so explainable why Christians don't keep the Sabbath, please tell me, why do people of the same tradition that have a strong tradition say exactly opposite things?
For, remember, it's Old Testament. So, it was for, who was God's chosen people during this time? His capital city, where he dealt with priests, the sacrifice, the salvation, law of Moses. It was Jews, and Jews. God gave the Jews the Sabbath, why? As a sign. Do you know who signs belong? Not to saved Christians. They go to the Jew. Yes, I acknowledge it. Everyone has to keep the Sabbath. But look at the context. It's future, at the time of the new heavens and new earth. And guess what? You do go to hell if you don't keep it.
Very early on in my spiritual walk.
That's a true dispensationalist right there, I tell you what. If you take the Bible literally in the heavy sense, which I tend to agree with for the most part, although not to the same degree, in the same way, it says all flesh will come to worship me on the Sabbath in the future, in the new heavens and the new earth, in fact. Every Sabbath. At least he's honest there. So Jesus introduces it in Genesis. They keep it the whole time. The New Testament, Jesus keeps it during the New Testament. They're keeping it after the book of Acts. And we know in the future, in the new heavens and new earth, we're going to keep it. But right now, we don't keep it because my parents didn't teach me to keep it. And I have 10 different answers that are incoherent and don't actually make sense. I'll give you 5 different answers, all of which are not compatible with each other. Is Jesus your Sabbath, or is it done away with? Do you keep it, but in a different way, or do we not have to keep it? Is it a moral law, or is it done away with? Do you need a day off, and to give a day off to those who are under your care, or not? Is Jesus your rest? You don't need rest anymore? Do you not sleep at night? Do you not take breaks? That would be bondage. Sabbath, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He's not talking about setting you free from God's law makes your burden light, unless you mean the sacrificial system and those sorts of things. Sin is a burden because of the damage it does. Remember, we agree with God now. The things that he says are wrong, that condemn us, we said, save me, Lord. I agree with you now. I turn from my sin, my transgression of your law, and I turn to your forgiving mercy so that I come as I am, and I am conformed to the image of the Son, which was demonstrated to us in the life and ministry of Jesus when he was on earth. He who knew no sin became sin for us. Mercy, forgiveness, love, commitment, sacrifice. But the standard is the standard. We still have to tell people who don't have Christ that they need his mercy. They need his forgiveness. Forgiveness of what? God is love. Loving God and loving your neighbor make a summation of the entire purpose of the law. Properly understood how Jesus demonstrated it, how he showed how they were hypocrites in misusing the law for their own benefit, not following the golden rule, which comes from the Old Testament. Loving God, loving your neighbor were principles of the old, was how it was given in the Old Covenant. That's a quote from Leviticus and Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and you shall love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. A summation is not a replacement in that sense. It's not a different thing. I mean, you could argue that it is a different covenant to some degree. It's not the Mosaic covenant. It's not simply renewed. We have a new priesthood, therefore that falsifies. It can't be the Mosaic covenant. He's the order of Melchizedek, which is what the covenant was, or what the priesthood was on earth before God made the Sinaitic covenant. There's no temple. You can't keep the Mosaic covenant. If God wanted a temple, there would be a temple. He doesn't require it. Paul makes that clear. The wall of separation has come down. The carnal ordinances and diverse washings, which is talking about the covenant, are done away with because the time of Reformation had come and the new covenant was here. It's not an entirely new thing. It's a renewed covenant in some sense. But if it's anything, it's what God was doing with Abraham, something like that, not entirely the same, because there's a timeline. Seems to me I would say Paul doesn't say you need to be circumcised. That was the controversy. People were saying you had to. There's nothing wrong with getting circumcised. I'm just saying it's not necessary to be part of the covenant, I think. I don't think they were merely saying, they were saying you don't have to get circumcised right away. You have to do it later. No, they're saying you don't have to do that anymore. You have to have your heart circumcised, in my opinion. I don't think that's so. Anyway, back to the thing.
With Jesus, I was exposed to Christians who thought that in order to honor God, they had to become like the Jews, keeping the Torah, the 10 Commandments, feast days, keeping the Sabbaths. If we listen to Jesus, he will teach us his ways. But if we listen to the Jews, we will become deceived and they will place heavy burdens upon us. Jesus did not say that we would find true rest by keeping the Sabbath days and by seeking out how to keep the law of Moses to a T. He said to go to him and that he is the rest. He never said that keeping a day of the week is the rest. Jesus is our Sabbath day rest. We cannot achieve the rest by keeping a Sabbath day like the Jews. And clearly, this is what they thought. They thought they could be holy by keeping the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, Torah, by keeping the Sabbath days.
Keeping the commandments of God is doing what he says. That is being holy. It's not being holy in the sense of you're saved that way. But we do what God says because he says it's holy. The Sabbath is called holy. So look, there is a difference between the weekly Sabbath and the new moon Sabbath. It's undeniable. And I don't get why people can't separate the two. For the most part, the new moon Sabbaths were added when he made the covenant, the Sinai covenant, which was prophesied to make way for a new covenant and call back all the nations. The stipulations given are geographically specific. They're not applicable in the same way by the same stipulations given from a worldwide perspective. That's just the facts on the ground. You have to sight the moon from Jerusalem. You can't do that if you're spreading out into the churches and out into the known world. There's no telephones. There's no instant messaging. You wouldn't know when they sighted the moon. I think God knew that you can't sight the moon the same way across the world, especially in the maybe now we could go by that, but not in the intervening 2,000 years. That tells you something. God didn't like, oh wow, I missed that. Does that mean you shouldn't keep the feast? Not necessarily, but they're highly tied to the temple services, which were types of Jesus. They were pointing to the sacrifice Jesus would make, which would be permanent and action, and the priesthood that he would be over, that wouldn't have to be done year after year. Okay, not everything about the festivals are that. So I'm not saying there's just anything wrong with it. I'm just saying I don't think it's a sin if you don't keep, the day of Passover according to the moon being sighted in Jerusalem or whatever, stuff like that anyway. So my point is, now those are appointed in the Bible. Those are appointed times of God, and the weekly Sabbath is an appointed time of God. But God established the weekly Sabbath at creation with Adam and Eve. Didn't have to command it. Didn't have to command do not murder, but it was a sin when Cain murdered Abel. It was a sin. Sin crouches at your door. Am I my brother's keeper? They were taught and shown and created to love each other, meant to, from the beginning, obviously. They weren't surprised that adultery and murder was wrong when they received the covenant on Sinai. God in Exodus 16 makes it clear that the Sabbath was already established. How long will you trample my Sabbath? When they were doing the manna. That's before the covenant is given. We know that 800 years before Moses wrote, there was a weekly Sabbath in Babylon, a type of Sabbath that was called Sabbatu. 800 years before that. Where did that come from? Did God borrow it when Moses wrote? Did he borrow it from them? Or did God establish it in creation and the Babylonians received it, some form of it? That's obviously the case, which proves the weekly Sabbath was established in creation, or you have to say God didn't really create the earth in 7 days and establish the Sabbath according to his rest and his creating. And that the whole idea that God created the Sabbath is just a polemic against ancient Near East gods. All that's garbage. I'm sorry if that's true, that's a problem. But there you have it. We know it was established before that. They understood it as a day of rest. Way before Moses wrote, we have it in history. So he did not establish it as a holy day at Sinai. Read Exodus 16 carefully. Therefore, if a case can be made that certain attributes of the Mosaic covenant are certainly not applicable in the new covenant. You don't do sacrifices for sins. You're not cleansed by the sacrifice, or unless you reject the book of Hebrews. Because he goes on and on about how that sacrifice of Jesus is perfect once for all, and the old priesthood would have to go in year for year, and the high priest would have to cleanse himself first. But Jesus, the perfect lamb, is both high priest and sacrifice. So, and he's said to be after the order of Melchizedek, which is what the priesthood was before the Mosaic covenant, running with Abraham. So I would argue that we're under that priesthood. So the weekly Sabbath cannot be classified as merely for the Jews. Sorry. If you take archaeology and history and the way God established it, he established it from the very beginning. Every Sabbath day has been declared holy by God from the very first one. There's no getting around it. I can appeal to Hebrews 9:10, Colossians 2, Ephesians 2 or 4, I forget, to show that Paul did give stipulations regarding certain aspects of the Mosaic covenant are not transferred into the new covenant. But as we see by James, Paul, Peter, the teachings of Jesus, what do they refer to every time when they're talking about what we are to do? And when it talks about love, the 10 commandments are cited. They are the royal law is loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God. which is a summation of the Ten Commandments, which in a sense is a summation, or the constitution of the entire Mosaic covenant. Everything provided by the things they did in the Mosaic covenant are still applicable. God doesn't give things that aren't needed. You need the sacrifice and forgiveness of sins, and that was a type, the sacrificial system. So you still need what God provides for sin, the forgiveness and the means, or I should say what's attributed by doing what God says, or by trusting God. You attribute the forgiveness of sins. And that's how they did it in the Old Testament, by doing the sacrifice. You still need that if you're not saved, if you're not in part of the covenant. You need that provision. That's why people go to hell. So people perish. They don't have the provision that's needed, that Christ provides. It's not provided by the temple services anymore. At least not now, because if that were true, we'd be screwed, because there is no temple. How would that even work in a worldwide system? It was not intended for the worldwide system, at least not in this age. So, there you have it. God gave the Sabbath to Adam and Eve. God did not give the festivals to Adam and Eve. They were established as he called his people out of Egypt and the journey they were on. Does that mean we shouldn't keep them? I'm not saying that. I don't think you have to. You could make a case for that. But what's clear is the Sabbath existed from the beginning, the weekly Sabbath, and as well as the other 10 commandments. It was always wrong to lie and steal and cheat and commit adultery and to worship idols instead of the true God, to take his name in vain. Those will always be a sin. I didn't put it in the 10 commandments, God did. Remember the Sabbath.